Classics in Archaeology Learning Community Series. We started in the fall, and we started it so that we can create communities. So seeing you here just before spring break makes us very, very happy. I'm the chair of Classics in Archaeology. My name is Katerina Zakaria, and it is my great pleasure to introduce one of our affiliate faculty, I would call him, a pre-modern historian teaching in the history department, Mark Anderson. So let me tell you a few things about Mark. He earned his BA in History and English Literature from the University of California in Los Angeles, and his MA in Religion from Yale Divinity School. He received his PhD in Roman History from Yale University. He also taught Greek and Roman history and the history of early Christianity at the California State University San Bernardino before joining LMU. Professor Anderson's current book project is entitled Hospitals, Hospices, and Poor Shelters, a late ancient health and welfare system, while his recent publications include Christianizing the Planetary Week and Globalizing the Seven-Day Cycle, and mistranslations of Josephus and the Expansion of Public Charity in Late Antiquity, which won the journal's prize for the best essay of the year. Let me welcome Mark, who is going to be talking to us today, as you see, constructing the first Mediterranean health and welfare system, which probably was better than the one America has today.
Thank you, Dr. Zakaria. I'd like to begin by recounting a familiar story. According to one of his first-century followers, Jesus of Nazareth told a story about a highway robbery in order to illustrate the biblical command to love one's neighbor. In that story, a Jewish man traveling on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was ambushed by thieves, robbed, beaten, and left for dead. After two of his countrymen refused to help, the Samaritan took pity on the wounded traveler and carried him to an inn. The Samaritan first treated the traveler's wounds himself and then paid the innkeeper to treat him while he went away. This story is a parable. It's a method of teaching common among ancient preachers. The parable is a literary form which blends fictional narrative with a factual social setting to illustrate a moral imperative. So this means that if we were to ask for the Good Samaritan's name or the year in which these events occurred, we would be asking the wrong questions. However, the road from Jerusalem to Jericho was in fact dangerous for travelers, and ancient Jews did not expect Samaritans to show care for their needy. My focus today, however, is on another element of the story, one its original audiences took for granted, but which puzzles us in the present. So if you found yourself in the same position as the Samaritan today, and you were willing and able to help a wounded traveler, how many of you would take that person to a hotel? Raise your hands. Maybe not so many, right? If you were to take that person somewhere, where will it be? Hospital. Most obvious, right? Naturally, hospitals are the central institutions of our healthcare system. So we have trouble imagining life without them. Yet Jesus' Samaritan took the wounded traveler to an inn and not to a hospital because there were no hospitals in the first century. Instead of building hospitals, the people of the classical Mediterranean made use of a variety of other forms of healthcare. Please note that the classical period is the period of history extending through the 3rd century CE. First and foremost, there was the family. If you fell ill in classical antiquity, you would first be cared for by one or more members of your extended family. Beyond that, there were professional healers for hire. Households of modest means would have gone to the village wise woman or wise man, a person knowledgeable about herbal remedies, paid a fee, gotten a special root or herb, and then the instructions for preparing it. Midwives made their living assisting at births, coming to the home where the expectant mother was lying in. There were also physicians for hire, who practiced the medical arts attributed to Hippocrates, a semi-legendary Greek physician from the 5th century BCE. Classical physicians made house calls, and sometimes they performed outpatient procedures at their offices, but they did not provide lodging for their patients. physicians could make a good living from wealthy clientele. Poor families could not afford their services. And those few physicians who sometimes treated the poor for free were praised. Many towns and cities also maintained public physicians. These healers were paid a stipend by the city council and made up the rest of their salary from patients' fees. This arrangement assured that the presence of a respected physician in a time of crisis, but it did not, as it was once thought, ensure free medical care. If you enlisted in the Roman legions, you were likely to receive medical care at an infirmary. These institutions were staffed by physicians with military rank, and they could be quite large and well organized. Roman aristocrats owning many slaves sometimes built infirmaries on a smaller scale to protect their investments, literally. But infirmaries were not open to the public. Finally, if you despaired of the limited capabilities of Hippocratic medicine, and many people did, you might turn to the divine. The most popular healing god of the classical period was the Greek divinity Asclepios. His temples were called Asclepieia, and over 300 of them have been identified all around the Mediterranean. Pilgrims flocked to these temples seeking miraculous cures for ailments against which medicine had failed. The priests of Asclepios charged fees, modest for the poor, higher for the wealthy, to spend the night in a special room under the temple where one might be healed by the god in a dream. So there were several healthcare alternatives to hospitals in classical antiquity. However, if you were poor and separated from your family, apart from military service or slavery, your healthcare options were limited. Now that we've seen how classical healthcare required at least minimal resources, let's return to the story of the Good Samaritan and focus on the aspect of poverty. Imagine for a moment that the traveler in this story has been robbed, but not beaten. If you decided to help a person with no possessions and wished to take him somewhere that he might find material aid, where would you take him today? Where would you take somebody who needs material help today?
Shelter.
A shelter, a homeless shelter, right? That would be the most obvious. Perhaps a soup kitchen. Now let's consider the classical alternatives. In Judea, where this story is set, your options were many. Ancient Jewish laws mandated a nationwide system of harvest sharing. Gleaning, for example, allowed the poor to harvest portions of fields they did not own. Travelers were also allowed to eat growing crops as they passed through fields. There were special taxes that funded soup kitchens and community chests for poor relief. Additional laws prohibited lending to the poor at interest and required debt forgiveness and the return of mortgaged land at the end of each 7-year period. Together, these laws formed a comprehensive welfare system designed to prevent, rather than ameliorate, destitution in the Jewish community. The system was designed specifically to protect the community's most vulnerable members, the poor, widows, orphans, and strangers. Understandably, it was difficult to enforce these comprehensive laws, and the biblical prophets repeatedly attempted to reform abuses of this system. A system that extended only to Judea and, to a limited extent, to the communities of the Jewish diaspora. The Greco-Roman world of the wider Mediterranean, by contrast, had a different means of redistributing wealth. Wealthy Greeks and Romans regularly spent large sums of money on public buildings, such as gymnasia and baths, and on public entertainments, such as athletic contests and holiday feasts. This practice was called euergetism in Greek and benefaction in Latin. Euergetism was rewarded with public honors, often in the form of inscriptions, along with public loyalty. So wealthy donors were always expected their proper returns. The Roman emperors, with their vast resources, were the greatest benefactors of all. The capital city was too large to feed itself, so the emperors organized fleets of ships from Egypt to supply 200,000 citizens with free grain. This food, along with state-sponsored chariot races, made up the famous Roman bread and circuses. Now, euergetism appears at first glance to be a welfare system, especially because its recipients were frequently described as poor in relation to wealthy donors. But what kind of poor are we talking about? Greek drama is enlightening on this point. In Aristophanes' comedy Wealth, produced in 388 BCE, the protagonist, a poor farmer named Cremulus, gets into an argument with the goddess Poverty. Cremulus thinks that poverty, unlike the god Wealth, has nothing worthwhile to offer. Fed up, he shouts at her, "What benefits can you provide except blisters in the bathhouse and masses of hungry children and old ladies? Not to mention the lice, gnats, and fleas, too numerous to count, that annoy us by buzzing around our heads and waking us up with the warning, 'Get up, or you'll go hungry.' And on top of that, you have us wearing rags, not coats, sleeping not on a bed, but on a bug-infested twine mat that doesn't let you get any sleep, under a threadbare burlap instead of a blanket, with our heads not on a pillow, but a hefty stone. And to eat, not bread, but mallow shoots, not cake, but withered radish leaves. We sit not on chairs, but on broken crocks. And instead of a kneading trough, we have one side of a barrel, and that's broken too. Now, haven't I revealed the many blessings you bring to all humanity?" Poverty is offended, but instead of denying his accusations, she says they actually don't apply to her. "No," she says, "the life I represent is certainly nothing like that and never will be. You see, you're describing the beggar's life, which means living without possessions. By contrast, the poor man's life means being thrifty and hardworking, and though he has nothing to spare, he doesn't lack necessities either." There are two Greek words for poverty in use here. Cremulus complains about his poverty throughout the play, but in fact, he owns a farm, a house, and a slave. He's one of the working poor, called a pennes, the lowest rank of citizen. A beggar, or one of the destitute poor, who lack citizenship, is called a ptokos. And the goddess Poverty makes a hard distinction between the two of them. Greco-Roman euergetism targeted the pennes and largely ignored the ptokos, because euergetism was a system based on reciprocity. The pennes was unable to return honor and loyalty for material benefits, while the ptokos, a person with no possessions or social standing, could not. Artemidoros, the author of a popular book on interpretation of dreams, stated the importance of reciprocity in giving in stark terms. In a dream, he writes, "Beggars receiving a coin predict a great and dangerous harm, often even death to the one who gave or to the one close to him. Beggars prefigure death because they alone among men, like death, do not give anything in return for what they receive." The destitute poor could not afford even the small fee for entry into the bathhouses, though they were sometimes allowed to sleep inside them at night when it was cold. And they appear to have been invited to dine at public feasts. The free grain in Rome, however, was not given to the hungry masses, but to citizens who presented tokens proving their right to distribution. Nevertheless, the constant supply of free grain did keep prices down and made it more likely that bread would find its way into the mouths of the neediest. The Romans did also give alms to individuals, even if to dream about doing so was bad luck. And a common proverb said the gods would curse anyone who denied a beggar his crust of bread. Some Stoic philosophers went further than this and taught a doctrine of the common humanity of all people, the destitute included. Nevertheless, the Greeks and Romans of the classical Mediterranean produced no poor shelters or welfare services of any kind directed toward the destitute poor. Now that we've surveyed classical forms of healthcare and welfare, let's move forward in time to compare them with those available in late antiquity, a period which began in the 4th century CE. In the early 5th century, the author of A Life of Daniel the Stylite recorded that a pilgrim on his way to visit this saint was, like the traveler in Jesus' parable, ambushed by thieves, this time on the road outside of Ankara in Central Asia Minor. This man, too, was robbed, beaten, and left for dead. In a further act of cruelty, the thieves cut the sinews behind his knees, perhaps to prevent pursuit. In this story, however, some travelers immediately carried the wounded man to the Bishop of Ankara, who then sent him to the city's hospital. There, he was treated by physicians and recovered from his beating, though he was still unable to walk. The bishop who administered the hospital approved of the man's purpose, so he provided the pilgrim with the companions, pack animal, and provisions necessary for him to complete his pilgrimage. The story ends happily with the man's legs healed by the saint's prayers. Now, I'd like to highlight 4 characteristics of the hospital described in this story. First, the man's free treatments and accommodation indicate that this hospital was a welfare as well as a healthcare institution. Second, there is a distinction between medicine practiced by the hospital's physicians and the miraculous healing performed by the saint. Third, the church administers this institution. And fourth, proximity is assumed. Travelers could carry this man just a short distance into the city and expect to find help. In fact, Ankara had at least 2 more such institutions, and this city was far from unique in the 5th century. The core of my research into late ancient healthcare and welfare consists of a catalog of just under 300 individual institutions, of which the Ankara Hospital is one. These were founded from the 4th through the 7th century in the Eastern Roman Empire, in the Western Empire and the Germanic kingdoms that succeeded it, in Armenia, and in Persia. These hundreds of institutions were divided into 9 categories in civil and ecclesiastical law. The names for these categories are all in Greek, and 8 of these 9 words were coined in late antiquity. The 9th, as we'll see, underwent a significant change in meaning between classical and late antiquity. So let's take a look at each. We've just encountered a nosokomeion, or a place for the care of the sick, which I translate as hospital. Hospitals dispensed medicine to the sick who were unable to pay for it, sometimes through physicians, but more often through nurses. And they accommodated travelers and the poor. The ptokotropheion is a place for the nurture of the destitute, which I translate as poor shelter. Care for the poorest of the poor, the ptokoi, is the primary function of this institution. Poor shelters also frequently accommodated travelers and provided medicine for the sick. The xenodokeion is a place for the reception of strangers, which I translate as guest house. The word xenos means stranger, guest, or host, depending on the context. The classical concept of xenia, or guest friendship, promoted ties between aristocratic families in different cities, so guest houses in the classical period were reserved for high-status citizens. Late ancient guest houses, by contrast, explicitly welcomed strangers of all kinds. These included pilgrims, refugees, traveling monks, the sick, and the wandering, destitute poor. Today, following centuries of specialization, it would be a mistake to take a sick person to a poor shelter, a destitute person to a hotel, or a traveler to a hospital for lodging. But the late ancient prototypes of these institutions admitted all such people without distinction. Since these 3 categories were so inclusive, they were also the most commonly constructed, and they account for more than 80% of all the institutions in my catalog. By contrast, the remaining 6 categories did serve specific subgroups of the needy. The gerokomeion is a place for the care of the elderly, which I translate as rest home. Guests at rest homes were often monks, since monks renounced family ties to join their monasteries. But they also welcomed the elderly who had lost their families, or those whose families could not support them. The orphanotropheion is a place for the nurture of orphans, which gives us our word, orphanage. Orphans have, by definition, lost their families, and they could reside in one of these institutions until they came of age. Details from late ancient orphanages are few, but in medieval institutions, children received an education, and the orphanage of Constantinople became known for its choral singing. The Brefotrofeo is a place for the nurture of newborns, which I translate as foundling hospital. These were closely related to orphanages, but we don't know, for example, whether there was a specific age at which children were transferred from foundling hospitals to orphanages. The exposure of unwanted infants was accepted in classical antiquity, but forbidden among Christians. And foundling hospitals provided a humane alternative to exposing unwanted infants to the elements and to near certain death. The Loyola is a place for birth care, which I translate as maternity clinic. In the early 7th century, the Archbishop of Alexandria, John of Cyprus, constructed 7 maternity clinics across his city. Each one had 40 beds, and women about to give birth were invited to stay for up to a week. When leaving with her infant, each new mother received a small amount of money. The Keiro Trofeo is a place for the nurture of widows, which I translate as widow's home. It appears to have been similar to the rest home, caring for elderly widows, but the details are very few because this institution is recorded only once, in a reference to 4th century foundations in Western Asia Minor. Likewise, the Tuflakomeo, a place for the care of the blind, which I translate as home for the blind, is known only from one source. This institution was constructed in Jerusalem, and all we know about it is that one of its staff members, a woman named Photis, journeyed from Jerusalem to Emesa in the early 7th century. The institutions in all these categories varied significantly in size. Guest houses on record, the smallest ones I should say, had 8 beds, while the largest institution in my catalog, a poor shelter founded by the Empress Eudokia in Jerusalem in the mid-5th century, had 400 beds. I estimate, though, that the average institution was on the small end of the spectrum, between 10 and 20 beds for the needy in each one. I've restricted the entries in my catalog to institutions that I can locate specifically in time and space, at least with the precision that ancient sources allow. We can only glimpse most of them, often at their foundation, but some appear in multiple sources over the course of decades, or even centuries. As is often the case in ancient history, the sources for the beginning of the phenomenon are the least certain, and no author reliably pinpoints the origin of this system. Instead, we must work forward from the references to the earliest institutions to trace its development. Those earliest institutions are dated to the reign of the Emperor Constantine, who ruled from 306 to 337 CE. Constantine was the first Roman emperor to embrace Christianity, and he and his mother were both known to have built large numbers of churches. Therefore, it is plausible that Helena built a rest home in the new capital city of Constantinople in the 320s, and that Constantine sent grain to the guest houses in the city of Antioch during a famine in 331. However, the sources for these activities are late. In contrast, we have contemporary sources for institutions dating to the middle of the 4th century. Some of these first hospitals are associated with early monasteries, which were established in Upper Egypt at this time. A famous complex of institutions was founded by the bishop and abbot, Basil of Caesarea, in Asia Minor in the 360s. These early foundations highlight the close association of health and welfare institutions with the imperial family, the institutional church, and the growing monastic movement. However, lay men and women associated with the biblical scholar Jerome founded a guest house and a hospital in Italy before the end of the century. In the 5th century, Constantinople, the burgeoning new capital city, became home to a large number of foundations. More were constructed in Egypt, Palestine, and Syria, which all had large monastic populations. And the system spread northwest to Gaul and southwest to North Africa. The 6th century was the most prolific period of health and welfare foundations in late antiquity. The system now spread to Spain, northern Francia, the new name for Gaul, and to the Crimean Peninsula on the north of the Black Sea. By the end of the 7th century, the system had become truly Mediterranean-wide. There are fewer institutions in Spain, North Africa, and the Balkans than elsewhere, but this correlates with the relatively small number of sources from those regions. I compiled these data from a wide variety of sources, including histories, architectural surveys, acts of church councils, letters, saints' lives, sermons, collections of inscriptions and papyri, and archaeological reports. But no ancient author ever attempted to list all of these institutions, so it's likely that many more than those represented here have been lost to the historical record. The origins of this system can therefore be traced to the first half of the 4th century, either during the reign of Constantine or shortly after. And the purpose statements of institutional founders and staff follow a clear pattern. They are always religious, and most frequently, they reference the Gospel of Matthew, chapter 25, in which Jesus equates acts of service to the poor, the sick, and strangers with acts of service to himself. When, for example, a Syrian monk named Paul, who distributed food to the men and women in the guest house of Edessa in the early 5th century, was asked why he did this every Sunday, he replied, "My Lord is found among the sick and strangers." So after analyzing the chronological development of the system and the intentions of those involved with its creation, I've concluded that the simplest explanation for the origin is the best. The first Mediterranean health and welfare system developed organically as a consequence of the legalization of Christianity by Constantine in the early 4th century. Christians since the 1st century had collected money, food, and clothing at their house churches for redistribution to the needy. They also prioritized visiting the sick and practicing hospitality. However, so long as the faith remained illegal, early Christians had little incentive to build institutions that would, first, attract unwanted attention to them, and then be torn down in the next persecution. The contrast in mindset affected by Christianity's legislation, Constantine's legislation in 313, was stark. Wealth and converts streamed into the church, a church that was no longer afraid to build publicly. And the construction of churches and monasteries expanded rapidly. Meanwhile, the poor gathered regularly on church porches to receive alms. It took little imagination to enclose a space attached to the building for their use overnight. Lay individuals began turning entire homes into guest houses instead of dedicating single rooms to that purpose. And the early communities of monks opened their newly established infirmaries to the public to create hospitals. Now that you have the sense of the system as a whole, who would like to visit one of these institutions? Raise your hands. A few hands here and there. Well, the rest of you are coming anyway. We'll travel to a guest house in southwestern Spain, this one here, because it is known from both contemporary sources and an archaeological excavation. This guest house was built by Bishop Masona of Emerita Augusta in 580 CE while Spain was ruled by the Visigoths. First, we need to consider how you'll arrive at this guest house. The pilgrim we learned about a few moments ago was carried to the hospital in Ancyra, and if you're in a bad way, you might be carried here as well. Masona ordered his physicians to make regular trips through the city to find sick people lying out in the streets and bring them inside. Therefore, the staff of such institutions had to be ready to physically carry a guest at any time. Indeed, a 4th century noblewoman from Rome named Fabiola and a 7th century Frankish abbot named Agilas are both recorded carrying guests on their shoulders while serving in their respective hospital and guest house. This is why Praejectus, a 7th century bishop of Clermont in Francia, directed that the physicians working in his guest house be strenuos viros, or energetic people. If you're in reasonably good health, you will probably arrive on foot like most guests, because, well, you can't afford anything else. But let's assume you have some resources, perhaps because you're a pilgrim on your way to visit the remains of the local Saint Eulalia, or a monk traveling on business, so you arrive on a horse or a mule. In that case, a groom will meet you to take your animal to the stables. Other guests' animals will be there in addition to those belonging to the guest house, so the stables will be large. Around this time, for instance, a guest house in Rome received 10 horses as a bequest. Camels were used to supply the guest house at the monastery of Mar Sabas in Palestine in the 5th century, and they had to travel up a steep path to get there. one unfortunate animal strayed over the cliff's edge and was lost. If you arrive without an animal and make a compelling request, you might even be lent one in order to continue your journey, as the Ankara pilgrim was. Once your mount is taken care of, you will be received by the host. This might be a person called the Xenodokos in Greek, the one who receives strangers. The Nosokomos and the Ptokotrophos served similar functions at hospitals and poor shelters. At a large institution like this one, however, that person will be busy with administrative duties. So you will be met by someone with a title such as minister in Latin or purgos in Greek, words which I translate generically as staff. No slave labor is mentioned in the sources for this system. It's unusual for antiquity, though slaves were often welcomed as guests. All recorded staff members appear to have worked as volunteers, been paid a salary, or served in their capacity as monks. While it's possible that you've only come for a meal, these institutions are distinguished from soup kitchens by their dormitories. So let's assume you're planning to expend at least one night, and upon entry, you'll be shown to your bed. Once you've placed your belongings by your bed, probably very few, you will want to bathe. Some large institutions, especially those in cities with access to water from aqueducts, were equipped with Roman-style baths, boasting heated pools. Most, however, made do with portable tubs and water heated over a fire. You will certainly, therefore, be able to wash your feet and hands, but you may have the opportunity for more thorough cleaning. If you are too ill to manage this yourself, it will be done for you. The 6th century Frankish queen and abbess, Radegund, was known for personally bathing the guests at her home for poor women, even when they suffered from horrific sores and gangrene. After your bath, you may request medical attention. At Masona's guest house, a physician will treat you according to your condition. We know that a very large Persian guest house employed 12 physicians, so there will likely be fewer than that here. Hopefully you won't have to wait too long. You might get lucky and be attended by Recared, a Visigothic physician whose 7th century epitaph was placed in the Church of St. Eulalia just down the street. He was said to have done his duty well. He might bandage a wound or concoct a plaster to cover sores. He has a variety of mostly plant-based drugs at his disposal. Guests of this system as a whole are known to have suffered from fever, dropsy, gout, elephantiasis, varieties of sores and swellings, and leprosy. Acute infections are notably absent from this list. You did not go to your local hospital during a plague in late antiquity. Perhaps ancient people, who did not know the mechanism of contagion, but did know that it involved physical proximity to the diseased persons, decided that gathering with strangers in a hospital during an outbreak would only increase their chances of infection. We've already discussed wounds inflicted by robbers, but we know that guests also suffered from damaged eyes and noses, as well as burns. Wild animals, too, posed a danger in Mediterranean antiquity that has since receded. A monk in 7th century Palestine spent a few days recovering in the hospital after being mauled by a leopard. Broken bones and hernias were common in a society characterized by heavy manual labor. Physicians at the guest house in 7th century Constantinople even performed hernia surgeries. Hopefully you've only needed minor treatment, and now you're ready for a meal. No guest house menu survives, but bread, water, and wine are the provisions mentioned most frequently. You might also be served meat, gruel, fish, oil, greens, fruits, or broth, and your animal will be provided with fodder. Masona wanted the food served in his guest house to be light and pleasant. If you're able to walk easily, you'll take your meal at one of a series of tables set up for guests. If it's wintertime, I recommend a place by the fire. The physicians will be preparing their medicines there, though, so space will be limited. If you are bedridden, you'll be served your meal lying down, and you may have a portable brazier brought to you for warmth. A guest house the size of Masona's might accommodate 50, so the kitchen will be a busy place. It'll be even busier if the cooks are also preparing meals there for the agricultural workers tending the fields that belong to the guest house, as was the case at the guest house of Marsabbas in the 6th century in Palestine. Here is a manuscript illustration of Basil of Caesarea and his brother Gregory of Nyssa personally performing the services that we've just discussed: bathing, treating wounds, and feeding guests at Basil's hospital in the middle of the 4th century. Okay, now that you've washed, had your medical needs tended, eaten, and hopefully chatted with some of your fellow guests by the fire, it's time for bed. Your bed will consist of a simple wooden frame and a mattress stuffed with straw or rushes. You'll have a blanket of linen or wool, and its thickness will vary depending on the season. You're in luck because Masona's beds are said to be particularly well made. Your bed will be situated in a row in a long open room on the 1st or 2nd floor. If you want privacy, a guest house is not the place to get it. You'll need to pay for an individual room at an inn. In a guest house of this size, women and men will likely sleep in separate dormitories. At a 5th century poor shelter in Alexandria, for example, men slept on the ground floor and women on the 2nd floor. Some types of institutions, such as widows' homes and maternity clinics, were reserved specifically for women, and so were certain guest houses, hospitals, poor shelters, and rest homes, especially if they were attached to and staffed by women's monasteries. A light will be kept burning in your dormitory all night, since physicians will make rounds and guests will arrive at odd hours. I hope you sleep well. In the morning, you'll have to decide how long you want to stay. If you're on a journey, one night is likely all you'll need. If you're recovering from an illness or from malnutrition, a few nights or a week is more likely. If you are able-bodied and wish to stay longer than a week, you will be assigned chores. This was the rule at a 5th century guest house in Nitria in Upper Egypt. These chores might include cleaning, cooking, baking, tending the sick, working in the garden or the fields, or some combination of these. We don't know what percentage of the staff members at these institutions first arrived as guests and then transitioned to working for their room and board, but it may have been significant. If you are disabled or chronically ill, and especially if you are on the bishop's poor registry, you may stay much longer without working. A Frankish man in the 6th century became deaf and mute following a severe fever, so his brothers, nice guys, had him declared insane and stole his inheritance. He lived in a guest house for 6 years until he was cured and able to return home. Many guests arrived suffering from terminal illnesses, so it's possible you won't leave at all. Large institutions have their own cemeteries and burial services. Recovery is the goal, however, and most guests leave these institutions better off than they arrived. Since you are well off, you may decide to give a gift to the guest house before your departure, but this is not required. The last thing you will do before you leave is receive a blessing. This may be a simple prayer from the host, but a blessing could also be physical. The poor shelter of Chersonesos in what is today southern Ukraine gave its guests ceramic tokens with a picture of the local Saint Phocas stamped on it. Your blessing might also be a small amount of money, such as the new mothers leaving the Alexandrian maternity clinics received, or perhaps a combination of these things. How many of you now think a stay in one of these places sounds like a pretty good deal? Raise your hands. Does anyone think it sounds like a little too good a deal? Maybe a few skeptics here. Well, many of these authors, the authors of this history, went out of their way to praise the founders of hospitals, guest houses, and poor shelters and leave a positive impression of the system. But careful reading reveals that these institutions faced the same challenges their modern descendants do, as well as some challenges unique to late antiquity. First, the temptation to misuse resources allocated for the continuing support of health and welfare institutions was considerable. In a letter from the early 5th century, Augustine of Hippo had to defend his priest, Leporius, from the charge that he had embezzled funds during the construction of a guest house. The Emperor Justinian issued a law in 528 decreeing that clergy who sold or bequeathed the properties of these institutions while managing them were to be stripped of their rank. This was an especially heinous crime if the properties were being held in trust for orphans. And Pope Gregory the Great, in a letter dated to the early 7th century, forbade the host of a guest house in southeastern Francia from running for the office of bishop, because he would be tempted to use the guest house's resources to fund his campaign. Without any intention of fraud, institutions could simply be mismanaged. In the early 7th century, in Hermopolis Magna in Upper Egypt, a host warned his superiors in a letter that neighbors, wealthy neighbors in fact, were taking advantage of his hospital's practice of lending animals for travel. In another letter, Gregory the Great, the Pope transferred the administration of the guest houses on the island of Sardinia away from the local bishop Januarius because they were suffering from serious neglect. Gregory would also have rebuked his colleague if Januarius were not so old, so ill, and so simple-minded. Ouch. Let's move now from the institutions to their guests. Founders and staff showed much care for the material needs, but little concern for the personal agency of potential guests, especially those who were very ill or disabled. Masona was not the only founder who ordered his staff to scour the streets looking for people to bring inside. It's therefore likely that some people in this situation found themselves inside a guest house or a poor shelter without their consent. But before I conjure up visions of 19th century poorhouses, which often confined the poor and forced them to work, I will state that I found no instance in which a poor, sick, or traveling person who stayed in one of these institutions was prohibited from leaving. On the contrary, staff members encouraged turnover to open up beds for those in more immediate need. This rule of non-confinement, though, has one important exception. I call this small group of people theopolitical prisoners. The imperial Christian church grew rapidly in size, wealth, and influence throughout late antiquity, and it was racked by numerous theological disputes. Since so much money and power were at stake in addition to religious concerns, disputes among clergy affected politics at the highest level, and sometimes turned violent. In this context, some church leaders found it convenient to imprison their opponents, always fellow clergy, inside health and welfare institutions that were under their control. For example, a deacon named Ischirion brought a formal complaint against his superior, Dioscoros, before the Council of Chalcedon in the year 451. According to Ischirion's testimony, Dioscoros had misappropriated funds intended for the poor, and, when Ischirion found out about it, had his deacon imprisoned in a guest house in Alexandria to keep him quiet. Later, Dioscoros even sent assassins to silence Ischirion permanently, but his fellow guests protected him. Rather dramatic moment there. In the year 523, a bishop named Philoxenos of Hierapolis found himself on the wrong side of a theological dispute and was imprisoned in a guest house in Gangra, which is in Asia Minor. His room was cramped, dirty, and located directly above the kitchen. He wrote in a letter that the smoke often choked him, and he soon died of causes unknown. The bishop and church historian, John of Ephesus, was imprisoned in a guest house in Constantinople in the later 6th century under similar circumstances. He was suffering from gout, but the staff at this institution both prevented his escape and refused to treat his illness. Flies, gnats, fleas were attracted by the smell of the guest house, he writes, and we imagine probably his own smell, and they tormented him exceedingly. These complaints raise questions about the cleanliness of these institutions. It's true that the prisoners' situations were exceptional, but I suspect that occasional positive comments in other sources about well-made beds and clean sheets, celebrate the exception rather than indicate the rule. It must have been an immense challenge to keep these institutions clean, even in an era when lye soap was coming into widespread use. And it was a challenge that poorly managed institutions surely failed to meet. There's also the issue of crime. When two monks staying at a guest house in Caesarea Maritima in Palestine in the early 5th century left for the day on business, their third companion remained in the guest house with their cloaks, presumably to prevent theft. In the year 581, thieves stole gold, silverware, and silk clothes from the Church of St. Martin of Tours in southern Francia. While on the run, they stayed at a guest house in Bordeaux. There, they got into a fight and one of them was killed, although apparently not inside the guest house. The resulting investigation, though, uncovered the stolen goods in their bags. So, the light kept burning all night in each guest house may have been as much for safety as it was for the convenience of late arrivals. Finally, these institutions were vulnerable to the common disasters of late antiquity: fire, famine, and war. A famous institution in Constantinople was named for its founder, Samson, a physician who had turned his home into a guest house. This guest house was burned down twice in the 6th century by fires set during riots, rebuilt both times though. A famine in the city of Edessa in Syria in the years 500 and 501 overwhelmed the city's guest house with hungry refugees. Emergency hospitals and guest houses were set up throughout the city in response and were equally overwhelmed. Burial crews sent out by the guest house worked around the clock for weeks. These institutions also tried and failed to provide refuge during times of armed conflict. When invaders attacked the monastery of Marsabas in Palestine in the late 5th century, the monks and their guests fled into the guest house and locked the doors, presumably barricaded them as well. So the soldiers simply broke open the windows and stoned those inside. The violence of the Persian sack of Jerusalem in 614 was much worse, and afterward hundreds of bodies were found inside 2 of the city's rest homes. But as significant as these challenges were, they were unable to halt the growth and development of this system. Rather, to my mind, they put more human faces on the immense challenges inherent in learning how to care for the neediest members of society for the first time. The earliest versions of today's hospitals, homeless shelters, rest homes, orphanages, and maternity clinics all date to this period, and their invention revolutionized our concepts of public health and social welfare. This system represents the concerted attempt of an entire region of the globe to raise its lowest socioeconomic class into full social personhood, an attempt from which we have much to learn as we continue to face the same challenge today. So I will leave you with these hopeful words from a poem entitled "In the Guest House." May the hungry find food, the thirsty drink, the visitor find honor. May the unclothed be able to find attire, may the weary find help. The languishing healing, the sad comfort, and may this house have concern for all. Thank you.
Mark, this was masterful, so I want to invite people to participate with questions. So just raise your hand. I don't need to. Yes, Jordan, you go. Just answer.
Thank you for that excellent talk. It raises 100 questions, but I'll try to ask just one.
Excellent.
I think you're absolutely have to be right that this is correlated with the rise of Christianity, this development of guest houses and hospitals. My question is, what significance do you attribute to the breakdown of central governmental authority, which seems to coincide with the rise of these types of institutions? And concomitantly, when you show a map, you have a lot of Frankish sites.
Yes.
You have a lot of Byzantine sites. Are these sites commensurate with each other, or are there differences in how a properly bureaucratic Byzantine guest house would function compared to effectively the Wild West?
The Wild West, yeah, exactly. To the first question, the earliest institutions actually are founded in a period of governmental resurgence. The Constantinian dynasty has actually ended a period of civil wars and brought peace. Though they do seem to thrive quite well in the shifting sands of the borders of the Western Germanic kingdoms also. The institutions east and west are less different than I expected to find them. The earliest literature that I did read on this usually makes a hard distinction between the two, but in fact there is an institution in Francia whose founder said, I am founding this explicitly according to the Eastern custom, that they are importing the words and many of the procedures that they are getting originally from the Eastern Mediterranean directly into the West, though they're not as well funded, definitely, and the largest institutions are all concentrated in the large cities of the Eastern Mediterranean and are generally imperial foundations. So anything with 100 beds or more is probably founded by an emperor.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Yes?
I have a couple questions. So I guess, what do you think you would attribute the separation of all those institutions to? Because they're obviously very intertwined in antiquity, and then, yeah. So.
Yes. How did they come to evolve into the separate, the very separate institutions that they are today? Because the words hospitality, hotel, and hospital all come from the Latin word hospes, which has the same semantic range as xenos, stranger, guest, and host. So our hospitals really are places of hospitality, and yet they have been so, I think it's the rise of modern medicine and all the expenses and expertise that are required, is that these institutions have separated off and said, well, really the only way we can provide top-level healthcare is if we concentrate the resources and expertise here, and only the people staying here are the ones who are actively being cured. And we've said, okay, other institutions with less specialization are able to take care of the merely material needs of those who are otherwise reasonably healthy. Seems to be that's the major bifurcation. But that doesn't happen until long after late antiquity. It doesn't really happen until the early modern period. Yes?
Do you think any of our modern medical procedures have their origin at this time?
That's an interesting question. This time period, late antiquity, is known by medical historians as a kind of medical refrigerator. There's no good opinion of medical advances in this time period in terms of the ability of physicians to learn new things about anatomy and apply them. This is a period when basically all physicians are testing their abilities against one another in terms of their knowledge of Galen, who is a 2nd century Greek physician who was particularly brilliant and eloquent, but his words became the last word for about 1,000 years. So not much in terms of new procedures. There are no discoveries about anatomy that I can trace to these institutions. But on the other side, this is a completely different way of approaching the idea of public health. So you have an entire class of people whose fate is only seen on the margins of classical texts, who would otherwise be lying out on the streets, in the elements, in all weather, who now have the opportunity to receive, at a minimum, a warm, dry place to sleep and a square meal for a few days. That alone can be the difference between life and death. And so whether or not they're getting the top-notch medical treatment of the day may not be the thing that pushes them over the edge. Yes?
So, having monastic life impact this?
Yes.
How did the spiritual side manifest itself? Did they have sacraments there, or?
Yes. So many institutions are, if not actually physically attached to churches or monasteries, they're very close to them in the complexes. Many of these institutions are staffed directly by monks who are rotating out of the monastery to take their shifts, welcoming guests. In some of these institutions, the poor are put under sort of quasi-monastic practices of enacting the regular services called the hours. There's one guest house that was built very specifically by its founder so that acoustically you could hear the Mass being sung in the church next door so that all the guests would benefit. So there's a strong overlap in spiritual practices and care for the poor and the sick in these institutions. Tony, you have a question as well?
Yeah, thanks for a really captivating talk. I actually have two questions. They're kind of somewhat separate, but since your survey goes through the 7th century, I was
Yeah.
wondering if the Arab conquests had any effect on the either like the functioning or the distribution of these health and welfare institutions.
Yes.
And then secondly, when you mentioned the problem of people dying at these
Yes.
institutions, and I was wondering if there have been any excavated cemeteries from these institutions where, like, I mean, is the is the evidence about sort of the maladies that they suffered from, is that textual evidence, or is there actual physical, like skeletons and,
Right.
and whatnot that have been
Okay.
found?
Excellent. First question then. The impact of the Arab invasions. I think that the impact of both of the Persian invasions followed by the Arab invasions on the system as a whole was substantial. The evidence for institutions founded in the first half of the 7th century is considerably greater than for the second half. So there does seem to be a drop-off. There's a real socioeconomic shock, I think, around the Mediterranean in the 7th century, and I can see it here. That's one of the reasons why, besides the fact that I study late ancient history and sadly not as much medieval history as I would like, one of the reasons to stop there is that there is a real break in the sources. Byzantine sources themselves drop off considerably as well, and then you move from Merovingian to Carolingian sources in the West. And your second question, there is no cemetery that's been excavated that I know of that can be directly associated with one of these institutions. I've uncovered several studies of exhumed bodies that are said to have come from paupers' graves in different periods. And some of those may have been adjacent to one of these institutions, but the number of ancient texts that I can correlate directly with archaeological finds is slim. That's one of the main reasons that I highlight Masona Xenodochium so much in this presentation, is that it's one of the few. And so his probably had a cemetery, given the size, but it's not mentioned in the archaeological report. Yeah. Yes?
Thanks, Mark. This is a really great presentation. Very interesting. I have what is probably a silly question. But I'm thinking as you're talking and talking about health and welfare system, I keep coming to the word charity.
Yes.
And I'm wondering, in terms of your own analytical framework, sort of analytically, how you tease out and apply the difference, if there is one, between charity and welfare.
Yeah, it's a good question. The word charity is being used sometimes, but not as often. Later, it comes in more in some of the later sources. The idea of caritas in Latin there. I don't see a huge difference, but I feel that the modern word welfare has a somewhat narrower semantic range than what this takes on in late ancient spirituality. And I want to focus primarily on that. It's the main reason that I choose welfare. Yes.
So I'm very much interested in how this starts and when and if ever it kind of bifurcates. So following up with it follows nicely from Elizabeth on caris as in Haris, or and how in classical Greece that you started with, and
Yes.
you also brought wealth and poverty there. This created a clientele system so that a pauper that is not a citizen has nothing to offer
Right.
to those who will benefit them. But those you can benefit might guarantee for you votes so that you will become popular and gain power.
Yes.
So there is that portion of it. And at some point in late antiquity, I think you mentioned around 6th or 7th century, where a physician turned his place into a guest house. And I want to see when the difference between charity and welfare and money making or power increasing sort of trend goes, because these are quite different.
Okay.
And I will also give a classical story to tie in with the charis portion
Mhm.
that is seen as the example of Solon, one of the 7 wise men, saying that who is the happiest man, and the second example is those 2 sons
Yes.
that carry their mother to the Oracle of Delphi, and the mother says, please bless them, and the next day they die.
Exactly.
Right, so it is the, you carry them to be to where they're going, and that's an old lady that goes to the church,
Mhm.
right? And then they're blessed by passing and being blessed in that way.
Yes.
So that in itself is the charis that they receive.
Yes.
So that is the welfare. But when does it turn to a profit-making business?
I mean, it's never a profitable business. It's never intended to be one anytime in this period. The hospitals that are actually making money much, much later, I would say, gosh, I don't think there's even one before the 19th century, that is an actual business venture. There is a connection with the classical idea of reciprocity, though, that is made in some of the sources, which is theologically appropriated by Christians in this identification that I mentioned that Jesus makes in Matthew, where he says, you do this to one of the least of these, you're doing it to me. And the founders of these institutions, on more than one occasion, do say explicitly, I would like all of those of you who are in this institution to pray for me. So, in a sense, those who were the very lowest and outside of the reciprocal system are being brought into it, not simply on the lower station, though, but actually as the patron of the patrons. They are actually God himself in a certain sense, and so they're being asked, pray for me, because the fact that I'm rich but I'm doing this is the thing that's going to help me in my position in the afterlife. And so, in that sense, the very poor can actually become the patrons in a patron-client relationship here. Dorothea, maybe you had one?
Yeah, I have a very naive question, and maybe I missed something at the beginning, but what can I imagine as the cure to be? So I got from your
Yes.
distinctions between the different institutions. It's taking care of people, it's feeding them, it's dressing them, it's bathing them. You mentioned pills at some point.
Yeah,
So that seems to be, but what else is there? So in a modern medical sense, what form of treatment were they given beyond just being dealt with nicely potentially?
Yes, exactly, right. So they're receiving Hippocratic medicine. There's no new style of, say, early Christian medicine here to contrast with that. So the Christians are adopting that. It's mostly dietetic, which is we change what you're eating in order to adjust the balance of the humors inside of your body. So it's entirely on a humoral theory, which has long since been discredited. There are surgeries that take place, though, which has a very direct continuity with antiquity. Though, of course, imagine surgeries with no true anesthetic or antibiotics. I ask you actually not to imagine that for very long. There's one fellow who is treated in one of these hospitals for hernia, a young man. His story is delightful because he says he's a deacon and he's an acclamator. That is, he's basically a cheerleader at the circuses. And so he leads people in these unifying chants that you can sometimes tell the emperor what you really think about him. It's kind of cool. And it's a pretty physical position. He says, I developed a hernia in my testicles. I think it was when I was doing my acclamations. I mean, it was either that or when I lifted something really heavy. But in any case, I have a serious problem. And he's going to the baths at odd hours because he's embarrassed and everything. And he tries various kinds of physicians. And finally he says, okay, I'm going to go to the guest house and I'm going to let the guys with the knives go for it. And then all he says is, I won't even tell you the horrors that I felt while I was on my back. What's amazing about it is that he, number one, survived, and number two, was at least temporarily cured. I was amazed to see this, that the 7th century physicians would dare operate on a genital hernia and that they could actually do something about it. Unfortunately for him, the repair was not permanent or particularly successful, so his condition relapsed. And as these stories usually end, he's cured not by the physicians, but by the saint, who is in a separate institution. So there is, much of our information actually comes from saints' lives and people who are saying, yeah, forget about those physicians. What you really need is faith. But they give us lots of really good incidental details about what's going on in these hospitals. Yes?
So one thing I noticed when people were asking questions is this interest in when antiquity hospitals transformed into money-making institutions.
Yeah.
And I wanted to point out that I think this is an American biased perspective.
Okay.
Because our healthcare system is very profit-based,
Yeah.
whereas it might be different in other countries. And I'm wondering if perhaps if you have seen at all if other countries have stuck to this antiquity kind of historical route, if because I think our healthcare system is just very unique.
Yeah. I think that the more socialized forms of healthcare, universally provided healthcare in several parts of Western Europe, Canada, and some other places, are the closest that we can get to the ancient system today in that sense, because they have this mandate that people will receive at least a certain level of care absolutely free by virtue of their citizenship. And it may not actually be entirely tied on totally legal citizenship. There is no system that I know of that maintains the strictly religious tradition. I mean, of course, many what are now characterized entirely as private institutions have religious roots, particularly the Roman Catholic tradition, and others in modern healthcare in the United States and around the world. And in the United States, those are strongly separated, this idea of public and private. But late antiquity has no such set of distinctions. Everything is so thoroughly intertwined. It's the question, which one is public? So, I can tell you that some of these institutions are founded by laypersons, some are founded by, of course, emperors and kings and queens on a large number, but that does not guarantee that that is a secular institution, whereas one run by the church isn't. And in fact, many that are founded by lay people within a generation are taken over by the local monastery or by the church, usually the institution with the resources to actually staff them and keep them going.
What about the hospitality aspect?
And the hospitality aspect, I think, has been lost to a huge degree, so far as I know. I am, entirely speaking completely out of my expertise with any modern healthcare systems or comparative healthcare, but this strong emphasis, the idea of caring for the whole person at a medical institution, it's because of the specialization, I think, it tends to be compartmentalized into different places. Yeah, there is an advantage to everything being mixed together at this time, although of course it was so much less efficient. But then, when your medical apparatus was at so much a lower cost, it didn't really matter as much. Yeah.
I just wanted to follow up on this, just to say, interestingly, during the refugee crisis in 2015 in Greece, the island across from Asia Minor, called Lesbos, about 700,000 refugees landed there, and the local people during the financial crisis gave them hospitality.
Yeah.
And when we were watching a film and analyzing it with LMU students, I realized that the names of the people that gave the hospitality were classical Greek and not Christian, and they kind of felt connected to that idea of Haris from ancient Greece. So
Yeah.
we try to continue the hospitality from ancient Greece. So I think these are cultural characteristics that they are, sort of maintained through, adopted and opted and co-opted. So that's kind of interesting, the aspect of hospitality. So that's one, and then still in monasteries you can find hospitality if you need to. So there is that, but sickness is a different case.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that is one of the strongest connections, though, between the classical and late ancient periods is the idea of hospitality.
Yeah.
And it's the rethinking is not in, was the hospitality before not good enough for what it did, but to whom do we apply it and how? And I think that is where the change comes in. But they continue, their idea of senia and goes into late antiquity in a big way. And I think one of the things that some people here are striving for is we want to at least have the goal of treating these very poor people the way we used to treat our social equals or even our betters when we would entertain them. Obviously, we're not going to hit that goal consistently, but it's out there.
I think at this point, let's thank Mark and all of you.